From the moment I married Jake, I knew his mother, Linda, didn't like me. She was the kind of woman who thrived on control, and I was the one thing in her son's life she couldn't manipulate. At our wedding, she accidentally wore white. When we bought our first home, she showed up unannounced with a real estate agent, insisting we'd made the wrong choice. And when I got pregnant with our daughter, Lily, her obsession with me hit a whole new level. She was convinced our baby had to look like a true member of the family. She'd make offhand comments about genetics, ask about my ancestry, and even joke about how some women lie about who the father is right in front of Jake. I thought it was just her being her, rude, controlling, and exhausting. But then, after Lily was born, Linda started acting strange. She barely held her granddaughter, which was odd since she had been so obsessed during my pregnancy. She would stare at her for long moments, like she was analyzing every feature. And every time I caught her, she'd quickly look away. I should have known something was off. Then, at a family dinner a few weeks later, Linda suddenly put down her fork and, with a deep breath, said the words that would change our lives forever. "Jake, we need to talk about Lily's real father." Silence fell over the table. My heart stopped. Jake and I exchanged a confused glance. "What?" he asked, laughing nervously. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. She reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope, and placed it on the table. "I did a DNA test on Lily," she said, "and the results don't match." My blood turned ice cold. She had secretly tested my baby? Without my consent? Without Jake's? Anger surged through me, but before I could say a word, Jake grabbed the envelope and ripped it open. His eyes scanned the paper, his face paling with every second. Then, finally, he whispered, "This can't be right." Because the test didn't say Lily wasn't his daughter. It said Jake wasn't biologically related to Linda at all. Jake stared at the paper in his hands, his knuckles turning white. His breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, I thought he might pass out. This has to be a mistake," he muttered, shaking his head. "Mom, what the hell is this?" Linda's face twisted into something unreadable, part panic, part guilt. She looked between me, Jake, and the paper in his hands like she was trying to come up with an excuse, a way out. I don't know how that could have happened," she stammered. "I thought the test would prove something else." "Prove what, Mom?" Jake snapped, his voice rising. "That my wife cheated on me? That Lily isn't mine? Is that what you were hoping for?" Linda flinched, but quickly straightened her posture. "I just wanted the truth, Jake. I thought maybe she was lying to you. You deserve to know." I felt my entire body shake with anger. "So, instead of talking to us, you violated our privacy and stole DNA from our newborn daughter? Do you have any idea how messed up that is?" She ignored me. She was still staring at Jake, her hands trembling slightly. "But this doesn't make sense," she whispered. "I gave birth to you. I know I did." Jake let out a hollow laugh. "Well, according to science, you didn't." His father, Richard, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat. "Maybe the test is wrong. False positives happen, right?" He looked at me, desperate for reassurance. I wanted to say yes, that it could all be a mistake, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. DNA tests don't just randomly say someone isn't related to their own mother. Jake was already grabbing his phone. "I'm getting my own DNA test. A real one. If this is a mistake, we'll know soon enough." Linda's face drained of color. And that's when I knew. She already knew the truth. She just never expected to get caught. Over the next few days, the tension in our house was unbearable. Jake barely spoke, barely slept. He had gone to the lab the morning after the dinner, getting his own DNA test done. He wanted answers. We all did. Linda, on the other hand, avoided our calls. She stopped coming over, stopped texting. It was like she had vanished, probably hoping she could somehow make this all go away. But 3 days later, the results arrived. Jake sat on the couch, the unopened email glowing on his phone screen. I sat beside him, holding his free hand, while his father sat stiffly across from us. "Whatever it says, we'll get through it," I murmured. He nodded, took a deep breath, and tapped the screen. His eyes moved rapidly across the text. Then, his face crumpled. "I'm not her son," he whispered. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I squeezed Jake's hand, feeling his whole body trembling. "What does it say exactly?" I asked gently. Jake swallowed hard and read out loud. 0% probability of maternity match with Linda Morrison. His voice broke at the last words. The truth was undeniable. The woman who had raised him wasn't his biological mother. Linda had been lying to him his entire life. The front door suddenly burst open, and there she was, Linda, looking disheveled and panicked. She must have known the results were coming today. "Jake," she gasped, stepping toward him. "I can explain." Jake stood up so fast that the couch nearly tipped. "Explain what, Mom? That you've been lying to me since the day I was born? That you stole a DNA test behind my back, trying to prove my wife was a cheater, and instead, you exposed your own damn secret?" Tears welled in Linda's eyes. "Please, sweetheart, just listen." Jake crossed his arms. "I'm listening." Linda inhaled shakily. "I never wanted you to find out this way." "Find out what?" Jake demanded. "That I'm adopted? That I was switched at birth?" "What, Mom?" She hesitated. And then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, "You were never supposed to be mine." Silence. Jake's breath hitched. "What?" Linda closed her eyes, as if steeling herself for what was about to come. When she opened them again, there was something there I had never seen before. Guilt. "There was a mix-up at the hospital," she admitted. "Your real mother, she never knew. And she choked on the words. "I found out, but I never told anyone. I couldn't, because if I did, I would have lost you." Jake took a step back like he had been slapped. "You're telling me you knew this whole time?" Linda nodded slowly, tears spilling down her face. Jake's face twisted in betrayal, in grief, in fury. "So you stole another woman's baby and just decided to keep me?" She let out a strangled sob. "I loved you, Jake. From the moment I held you, I knew I couldn't let you go. I made a choice. A terrible choice, but one I can't take back." The room spun. My heart pounded in my chest. Jake clenched his fists, his voice shaking. "So where is my real mother?" Linda looked away. And that's when we realized she had never even tried to find her. Jake stared at Linda in stunned silence. His whole life, his entire identity, had just been ripped out from under him. And the worst part? The woman he had trusted most had been the one to betray him. "You never even tried to find her?" His voice was quiet, but the anger beneath it was palpable. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced toward Richard, as if expecting him to help her, but he just shook his head, disappointment heavy in his eyes. Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Unbelievable. You knew for years, decades, and you never once thought to tell me? To let my real parents know their baby had been stolen from them?" Linda's face twisted in pain. "I didn't steal you," she cried. "It was a mistake at the hospital. They gave me the wrong baby, and when I found out, I had already bonded with you. You were my son, Jake. No piece of paper was going to change that." "But I wasn't your son," he shot back. "Not really. And you knew that." Tears streamed down her face. "I was scared, okay? I thought if I told the truth, they'd take you away. I couldn't bear that. I made a choice, maybe a selfish one, but I loved you, Jake. I still do." Jake took a step back, shaking his head. "You don't get to play the victim here, Mom." His voice cracked on the last word. "You kept me from my real family. You stole my entire past from me." Linda sobbed into her hands, but Jake was already turning away. He looked at me, his eyes full of pain. "I need to find them," he said. "My real parents." Richard finally spoke. "We'll help you, son." Linda flinched at the word son, as if it no longer belonged to her. Jake didn't look at her again. "I need space," he muttered. Then he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. I hesitated for only a moment before following him. Behind us, Linda's sobs filled the house, but for the first time, I didn't feel sorry for her. Because she hadn't just lost her secret. She had lost her son. We drove in silence. Jake gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw clenched as he stared at the road. I wanted to say something, anything. But what could I possibly say to make this better? His entire life had just been ripped away from him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pulled into an empty parking lot and turned off the engine. He let out a shaky breath, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. "I don't know who I am," he whispered. My heart broke. I reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You're still you, Jake. Nothing changes that." He let out a humorless laugh. "Everything changes. My whole life. I thought I knew where I came from, who I belonged to. And now? Now I don't even know my own last name." I squeezed his arm. "Then we find out. We find them." Jake swallowed hard, nodding. He lifted his head, his eyes glassy. "Where do we even start?" I grabbed my phone and pulled up a search engine. The hospital. If Linda was telling the truth, then it was a mix-up, which means there's a record. A birth certificate, something. Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. What if they're gone? What if I never get to meet them? I took his hand in mine. "Then we keep looking until we do." After a few moments, he nodded, determination settling in his expression. He put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, heading toward the hospital where he had been born. Neither of us knew what we would find. But one thing was certain. Jake wasn't leaving without the truth. We arrived at the hospital an hour later. It was a small facility, one of those places that hadn't changed much in decades. The beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and outdated chairs in the waiting room gave off an eerie, frozen-in-time feeling. Jake clenched his fists at his sides as we approached the reception desk. An older woman with reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing us with polite curiosity. Jake cleared his throat. "I was born here in 1992, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his eyes. "And I need to see my birth records." The woman frowned. "We don't typically release birth records without proof of identity and parental consent." Jake let out a bitter chuckle. "That's the problem. The woman I thought was my mother might not be my mother at all." Her eyebrows shot up. "I see," she murmured, her gaze softening. "Give me a moment." She turned to her computer, typing something in. We stood there in tense silence, the only sound being the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard. Minutes felt like hours until she finally looked back up at us. "Well," she said, pushing her glasses further up her nose, "there was an incident in 1992. A case of 2 newborns being placed in the wrong bassinets. It was never formally reported, just an internal mix-up that was corrected before the parents left the hospital." Jake's breathing grew heavier. "Corrected," he repeated. She hesitated. "That's what the notes say. But given what you're telling me, it sounds like someone wasn't entirely honest about what really happened." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Do you have the name of the other baby? The one I was switched with?" The receptionist hesitated again, looking conflicted. "I shouldn't be giving you this information without proper authorization," she sighed, then lowered her voice. "But if what you're saying is true, you deserve to know." She turned the screen slightly toward us. Jake leaned in, his eyes scanning the record. And then he froze. I followed his gaze, my stomach dropping as I read the name listed under Mother for the other baby. Margaret Holloway. Jake whispered the name under his breath, like he was trying it on, like it somehow felt familiar. Then he looked at me, his eyes wide. "I have to find her." I nodded. "Let's go." Neither of us noticed the receptionist watching us, her expression unreadable. But as we turned to leave, she said one last thing. "There's something else," she called after us. We both stopped. She hesitated, looking almost nervous. "Margaret Holloway. She came back to the hospital 2 years later, looking for answers." Jake's entire body went rigid. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist sighed. She was told the mix-up never happened, that she had given birth to her biological son. The hospital covered everything up. I felt sick. Jake's jaw clenched. "Where is she now?" The receptionist hesitated before scribbling something on a piece of paper. She slid it across the counter. "This is her last known address," she murmured. Jake took the paper, gripping it like a lifeline. He looked at me, his expression raw, determined. "We're going to see her." We drove in silence, the weight of what we had just learned pressing down on us like a heavy fog. Jake stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. I could feel the storm brewing inside him. Anger, confusion, fear. Margaret Holloway. The name felt significant, like it had been lingering in the background of Jake's life, waiting to be discovered. This woman had searched for him before, had felt, deep in her bones, that something wasn't right. And now, after all these years, he was finally going to meet her. When we pulled up in front of the address the receptionist had given us, my stomach twisted. The house was small but well kept, with flower beds lining the front porch. It looked warm, welcoming, like the kind of place where a loving mother lived. Jake sat frozen in the driver's seat, just staring at the house. "Are you ready?" I asked gently. He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I have to be." We stepped out of the car, and I stayed close to him as we walked up to the front door. He hesitated for only a second before lifting his hand and knocking. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s. She had kind eyes, lines of worry etched into her face, and the moment she laid eyes on Jake, she gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered. Jake's breath hitched. "Are you Margaret Holloway?" She nodded, stepping forward, her eyes never leaving his face. I am." Her voice trembled. "And you? You look just like him." "Like who?" Jake asked, his voice tight. Margaret reached for the doorframe, as if she needed something to hold her up. Then, in a breathless whisper, she said, "Like my husband, like the son I lost." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pressed a hand to her chest, shaking her head in disbelief. "I knew it. I always knew." Jake stood there, frozen, as if his body couldn't decide whether to move forward or run away. Margaret let out a soft sob. "I looked for you. For years, I looked. But they told me I was wrong. That my baby was mine. That I was imagining things." She reached out as if to touch him but stopped herself, her voice breaking. "I can't believe it. My boy, my sweet boy." Jake exhaled sharply, blinking rapidly. I don't know what to say." Margaret smiled through her tears. "You don't have to say anything." Then, barely above a whisper, she asked, "Can I hug you?" Jake hesitated for only a second. Then he stepped forward, and Margaret wrapped her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. And just like that, after 32 years, Jake was finally home. Jake stood stiffly at first, as if his body was resisting the moment. But then, slowly, his arms wrapped around Margaret, and he clung to her like a man grasping onto something he had been searching for his entire life. I stepped back, giving them space, my own eyes burning with unshed tears. This was the moment Jake had unknowingly been waiting for. The missing piece of himself, the truth he never knew he needed. After what felt like forever, Margaret finally pulled back, wiping at her tear-streaked face. "Come inside," she said, her voice still trembling. "There's so much to talk about." Jake nodded wordlessly, and we followed her into the house. The inside was just as warm as the outside. Family photos lined the walls, the scent of fresh coffee and something sweet lingering in the air. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. A picture sitting on the mantel. I walked closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was a photograph of a young man, maybe in his early 30s. He had the same piercing eyes as Jake, the same strong jawline. If I hadn't known any better, I would have thought it was Jake himself. Jake saw it too. He stepped toward the photo, picking it up with shaky hands. "Who is this?" he asked. Margaret's face softened with both love and sorrow. "That's Daniel," she said quietly. "My son." Jake looked at her, confused. "But if I was switched at birth, then he's the one who was raised as me?" Margaret nodded, her expression pained. "Yes." A deep silence settled over the room. Jake swallowed hard. "Where is he?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the kitchen table. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy. I could feel the answer before she even said it. "He passed away," Margaret finally whispered. 2 years ago." Jake's breath hitched. "What?" Margaret's voice broke. He had a heart condition, one that could have been treated if we had known about it sooner. But we didn't, because it didn't run in our family. She looked up at Jake, her eyes filled with unbearable grief. If I had known he wasn't mine biologically, we could have caught it early. He could have lived. A sharp gasp left my lips. I reached for Jake, but he didn't react. He was just standing there, frozen, staring at the photograph. Then, in a voice so quiet I barely heard it, he whispered, "That should have been me." Margaret's head snapped up. "No," she said fiercely, stepping toward him. "Don't you ever think that. I lost one son. I won't lose another." But Jake was already unraveling. He turned away, rubbing a hand over his face, his breathing uneven. "All this time, I had a brother, and I never even knew." His voice cracked. "And now he's gone." Margaret reached for him, but he stepped back. "I need air," he muttered, heading for the door. I followed him, pausing only to glance back at Margaret, whose face was twisted in sorrow. "I'll bring him back," I promised her softly. She nodded, tears falling down her cheeks. And then I stepped outside, into the cool evening air, where Jake stood with his hands on his knees, struggling to breathe. I placed a hand on his back. "Jake," I whispered. He didn't look at me, just let out a shaky breath and said, "I don't know how to live with this." Jake stood there, his breath ragged, his body shaking under the weight of everything he had just learned. I stayed by his side, rubbing slow circles on his back, waiting, giving him space. "I should have known him," he finally whispered. "Daniel, my brother." His voice broke on the last word. "He died because of something that wasn't even supposed to be his problem. That should have been my burden, my risk." I turned him to face me, gripping his arms firmly. "Jake, stop. You can't think like that." He let out a bitter laugh, his eyes red and glassy. "How can I not? That was supposed to be my life, my family." He lived the life I should have had, and I lived his. His voice was hollow, filled with guilt and grief. "And now it's too late." I cupped his face, forcing him to meet my gaze. "But it wasn't your fault. You were a baby, Jake. You didn't choose this. None of you did." His chest rose and fell heavily, his hands trembling at his sides. "Then why does it feel like I stole something from him?" I swallowed back my own tears. "Because you're grieving, and because you're a good man." He shook his head. "What do I even do now?" I thought about Margaret, about the way she had looked at Jake, like she had been searching for him her whole life. I touched his hand gently. "You go back in there. You talk to her. You learn about Daniel. You let her learn about you." Jake let out a slow, shaky breath. He turned his head toward the house, staring at the warm glow from inside. "And my parents?" I hesitated. "That's up to you." His jaw tightened. "Linda lied to me for 32 years. "She did," I agreed. "But she also raised you. And maybe that's something you'll need to sort through. In time." Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to me. Then, gripping my hand tightly, he turned back toward the house. Margaret was waiting in the doorway, her hands clasped together, her face full of hope and fear. Jake stopped in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a quiet, raw voice, he asked, "Can you tell me about him?" Margaret's face crumpled, and she reached for his hands. "I would love to." Jake nodded, swallowing thickly, and as we stepped inside, I knew this was just the beginning of his journey. The past couldn't be changed. The pain wouldn't vanish overnight. But in this moment, Jake was taking his first step forward, and that was enough.